Good morning and welcome to this conference. First, obviously, an apology for me that I had to go unexpectedly to London. I was looking forward to being here at the NEPACS conference. I've known NEPACS for many years, and in addition, I am slightly out of touch, in truth, with the latest moves in trying to save women from prison. So I was looking forward in particular to the Prison Reform Trust speech. However, here I am to tell you what I can about this important topic. The temptation to answer the question in your title, does prison work for women, by simply saying no and then leaving, was almost overwhelming. But that is the tenor of what I'm going to say. My position about all this then, I'm the Police and Crime Commissioner for Northumbria. That means that I am elected to be the people's representative in the police force. I am there to make sure that the police deliver the priorities of the public, and I'm able to do that because I have the police budget to use as leverage. Of course, that requires me to find out what the public's priorities were, and so I did so when I was elected just less than 2 years ago, and they included, not surprisingly, cutting crime. So clearly, insofar as there are things that can be achieved to cut the crime committed by women, there is a very direct interest from me. However, the job is not just to have that role with policing, making sure they do what the public want. It has some other dimensions. So I must work by statute with the community safety partnerships, trying to stop crime from happening in the first place. So supporting them in youth diversion schemes, that kind of thing. And at, as it were, the other end, I have a role to work with the criminal justice agencies to produce an efficient and effective criminal justice system. Consequently, I have an interest really in crime from the start, trying to stop it happening, all the way through policing if it does happen, into the opportunity to influence the criminal justice process at the end. I have a particular interest, which is pretty well known, in dealing with violence against women and girls, and we have a regional strategy on that theme with the two other police and crime commissioners in NEPACS area, who are Ron Hogg in Durham and Barry Coppinger in Cleveland. We spent yesterday celebrating the first year of that violence against women and girls strategy, and we think we are making real progress. The significance of that I'll come back to in a few minutes. Obviously, if one of my priorities, because it's the public's, is cutting crime, I am to some extent a hostage to what the probation service can do to try to cut re-offending, and here in this topic about women. And I raise the concerns that I think are in your preliminary papers about the wisdom of the government's changes to the probation service. Northumbria Probation Trust was great, actually. It exceeded expectation every year, and although there is recidivism, nonetheless they were excellent, and it is a shame that they have now been divided up into two and they will be sold off to Sodexo sometime, I think, in the new year, and we have to hope that that under 1 year sentence cohort, which is coming into aftercare for the first time, as I'm sure you know, that is a very good thing, and I cannot think of better people to have supported those 1 year and under cohort when they left custody than Northumbria Probation Trust. So I think that idea is fine, but I am concerned about the change otherwise. Tracking back, I was a criminal QC for many years, and I defended by and large, and I defended obviously a number of women, though 90% of crime is committed by men. They tended to be three kinds of women that I dealt with. One was those, and I guess you'll hear about this from a later speaker, those who had effectively been pressured into crime by a male partner. In particular, I was involved in a lot of cases arising out of the gangland activities in Moss Side in Manchester some years ago, and there young women would frequently be arrested for possessing the most appalling weapons, which their boyfriends had hid in the airing cupboard or sometimes in the kids' cot, and left them responsible. I did once run a trial in which a young woman had been pressed by her boyfriend enormously to support him in a programme of frankly grooming youngsters to supply them to businessmen for sex. She, with my support and help, ran the defence of duress, that she had been put under sufficient pressure by him to have lost her will to resist, and she was in fact acquitted. The third kind of women I defended then was what we called in those days battered women who'd killed their violent partners. That is to say, women who'd suffered domestic violence for a very long time. He came in for one further attack. It looked terrifying, and she would seize a knife in the kitchen where she'd fled from him and strike out once, killing him. There were not that many of those, of course. Far more perpetrators of domestic violence kill their partners, but that movement of women who responded in that way met with very poor responses from the criminal justice system. We had a lot of work to do to change the law, which Labour ultimately did when we were in government, to make the defences fairer for somebody in that position. So that's my experience, as it were, of women in court when I was a barrister. But by 2001, I had changed career and was the Member of Parliament for Redcar, and it's at that stage probably that I come closest to your agenda, because I was asked to run something called the Fawcett Commission on Women and the Criminal Justice System, set up to investigate how the criminal justice system dealt with victims, with defendants, and also, though we needn't pursue it today, with workers in the criminal justice system. And there, I think, is when I first saw something that was, for me, quite a breakthrough. We obviously broke down our workload into victims and defendants in order to try to accumulate evidence on which to form views. Our defendants were largely in custody or on community programmes for quite minor charges, not serious stuff at all. Our victims were almost exclusively victims of domestic violence and of sexual abuse. We would put out a bid for evidence. We had to tune our channels to try and hit the right people. When we put out a bid for victims who were women to come forward and talk about their experiences in the criminal justice system, we got only people who wanted to talk about rape and domestic violence. So we put out a fresh bid for evidence saying, please tell us about your experiences as victims in the criminal justice system in other kinds of field. But we got absolutely no response, which either means that the criminal justice system, which I doubt was dealing perfectly with the victims of burglary who were females, for instance, or it meant that everybody who'd had contact with the criminal justice system was worried about the way in which domestic violence and sexual abuse had been dealt with. Very interestingly, we then looked at the conclusions we were to draw for this, and we moved to considering female defendants. And we found that they were, as I've said, largely in custody for relatively small offences. Something like 70% were for non-violent offences. Most were in for less than a year, and that was where the repeat offending took place. People who were in custody for less than a year. Importantly, we found out that about 70% of women in custody had 2 or more mental health issues and either drug or alcohol abuse. Many had had early lives in care, but here was the very fascinating and sad fact, which was that about 50% had suffered from violence at home and about a third had been sexually assaulted. If you look at the usual figures that 1 in 4 women in society suffer from violence at home, you can see that they had exactly twice the frequency of it. And they had twice the frequency too of sexual abuse. And so we sat back and we thought about the 2 pieces of work we'd done, and we concluded that when we considered victims of crime who largely had suffered from domestic or sexual abuse, and when we considered defendants in crime who largely had been thrown into chaos by their experiences of sexual and domestic abuse, that actually we were talking about the same people. was a dramatic breakthrough for me, and it's an important understanding that has carried with me ever since. As Fawcett's commission started to produce its results, there was a vast increase noted in women in custody. I think it increased between 1995 and 2005 by 69%. The figures were then that 85,000 males and 4,000 females approximately were in custody, so always a tiny, tiny part of that population were women, and of course that meant they got very little attention. I looked up the figures yesterday, and it is now 88,000 males and 3,943 females in custody, plus ça change. However, the most important thing was that there was then a spate of suicides at Style Prison whilst Fawcett was reporting, and I had some contact with Fiona McTaggart, then a Minister of State at the Home Office, who wanted to look into the whole state of women in prison. And between us, we came up with the perfect chair for that inquiry, who was Jean Causton, now Baroness Causton, who sadly can't be here today, but who still remains a terrific force for women and imprisonment. The contents of her report reflected, although in a good deal more depth and with a good deal more full recommendations, pretty well what we had found as Fawcett. She found further that about 2/3 of women in custody were mothers. Quite a lot of them will have lost the care of their children. About 85% of all the women in custody had children. About 18,000 children a year were separated from their mother and often had to move home and therefore school because their mothers were in prison. She found, as we had, that most of the sentences were small. If the idea of prison is to protect you and me against violent offenders, that wasn't being used appropriately. It was largely dishonesty. It was mostly chaotic dishonesty and other kinds of small offences that mounted up until ultimately the magistrates, to be totally fair to them, could not think what else to do. And sometimes, as Jean found, sent people to prison for their own good. Of course, that doesn't work. If you're already suffering from the kind of multiple traumas that I've set out are common in this population, and then on top of that, you're put into custody for just long enough to wreck your home life and get your children taken away, probably for you to lose your tenancy, and yet it isn't long enough for you to get onto any anti-addictive treatment or any rehabilitative treatment, then all the prison has done is make your situation 10 times worse. And that was the very clear conclusion that Jean came to, and that therefore you should look better at community programmes. I do not think anything has changed in that recommendation. Now, we made some progress with the implementation of Jean Causton's recommendations. I was, as a minister, which I became in 2006 in the Ministry of Justice, on the Causton committee which tried to drive that agenda, and I stayed on when I became Solicitor General in 2007, and certainly we stopped strip searching, we improved prison conditions. There was never much progress to be made with the prison estate about having small prisons locally, which had been one of her key recommendations, so that women didn't have to do what they still have, which is being hugely separated from their families, because the very few women's prisons there are mean that they tend to be a long way away unless chance plays a role from where they live. I should just in passing mention remand, which Jean Causton found was another mischief. Remand relatively short and often followed by sentencing which wasn't custodial, but nonetheless playing the same role of separating women from their families. And so I hope, and I do believe, that we have got better at that. Women used to be remanded in custody, for instance, for psychiatric reports. So no real evidence that they needed psychiatric assistance, but keeping them still, the courts would think, long enough to investigate that point which had been raised, seemed to me to be the ultimate cruelty, and we now do that at least very differently. So let's look, though, at the alternatives, because a problem about women's community sentences has always been that small number of women who are in the criminal justice system in the first place, so that they have tended not to have the focus and the attention. Look back again to the things I described, the multiple needs that those women have, and how complex, therefore, their cases were, how complex a set of programmes and the set of inputs they are likely to need in order to be rehabilitated in the community, and the lack of likelihood of application being put into that when the overwhelming number of repeat criminals are men. That is a dilemma. I cannot see the dilemma being improved by payment by results, a component at least in the new probation arrangements. I attended a stakeholder meeting in connection with the bidders for this process of privatising the community rehabilitation company, which is what the low-risk half of the probation service here is now called. And in that stakeholder group, we were asked to recommend the kinds of prisoners and the kinds of criminal defendants who should be given priority by the supplier of probation services. And I mentioned women, and I also mentioned people who've got alcohol problems, veterans, and a range of other people. And the response from one of the leaders of one of the bidders was that there's just no volume in any of those cases, so that you can do a standard package for a defendant and justify your payment by results by volume passing through. Well, that cannot, of course, possibly apply to women, and so one hopes that the provision Chris Grayling has put in to the legislation to require that proper women's provision is made exceptionally, because he has not shown himself to be a person who understands women's needs. You all know, I dare say, that legal aid has been so undermined that it's now only about half of domestic violence victims who can ever get legal assistance to contest maintenance and try to get their children. So not necessarily somebody who's shown himself sympathetic to women, but let us hope that he drives home with the new suppliers of probation resources the need for specific programmes. And so I really end where I began, which is to say how much I regret not being able to be with you today, so that I can learn for myself what updates, what better things there have been since I was more closely involved in your territory then than I am now, so that I can actually get back involved in that. There were some quite good community programmes. I devised the conditional caution for women only when I was Solicitor General. The caution was because someone admitted a small offence, the condition to go and have her needs assessed at a women's centre. A slight condition, and the women's centre said to me, don't worry, if we get a person to come on your condition, she'll stay with us at a women's centre, because we can offer her all the things that our needs assessment shows she needed. So that thrived for a while, and possibly still is thriving in some ways. Other packages were hugely successful. There was a scheme called the SWAN scheme here in Northumberland, which cut recidivism amongst women by 60%. So, even as I say, it's not a position in which there's been massive change in the population in prison. There does not appear to have been at all the complete accomplishment of all that Jean Causton thought would put that right. Nonetheless, there have been some bright sparks of activity, bright sparks of good schemes to help women. Of course, stopping the causes of crime in the first place is also extremely important. I'm now quite satisfied that poverty is playing a role in the increase in shoplifting that has gone on amongst women here in the last year. But it is also the case that much of it is attributable to the chaos caused by male violence. And so, let me say, as I leave you to discuss today, may I recommend that you have a look at our Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, see if you think we're getting it right, and that we do stand a chance in the North East through the 3 Police and Crime Commissioners of cutting the incidence of violence against women and girls, and consequently playing our role in stopping women from becoming criminalised in the first place. I wish you a very successful day.